This week on Jerusalem Dateline, a deadly terror attack claims lives as Israel celebrates its independence. Plus, why is the Palestinian Authority hiding its financial reports? And a special photo archive chronicles the miraculous development of Israel. And a Ukrainian child gets life-saving heart surgery in Israel. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Two Palestinian terrorists entered the central Israeli city of Elad and launched yet another terror attack. Some fear the latest attack could lead to another war or the collapse of Israel's government. The terror attack came just at the end of Israel's Independence Day, when Israelis were celebrating the birth of the nation 74 years ago.
We're talking about several crime scenes in the city of Elad. Unfortunately, we have 3 dead people, 3 dead citizens, and several wounded that were taken to hospital.
It was the 7th in a wave of terror attacks in the last 2 months that have killed nearly 20 and wounded dozens. The 3 fathers murdered on Thursday were reportedly in their 30s and 40s and left behind 16 children. And as they have after other terror attacks, Palestinians celebrated in Gaza by passing out candy. Hamas praised Thursday's attack, where the 2 terrorists used an axe to murder and maim. Just days earlier, Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar encouraged Palestinians to attack Israelis and recommended what weapons to use.
Whoever has a gun should prepare it, and whoever does not have a gun should prepare his cleaver, axe, or knife.
He also issued a call to Palestinians in the West Bank to launch more attacks.
Do not wait for a decision by anyone. The lone wolf operations have proven to be extremely successful.
On Memorial Day, just 2 days ago, Israelis stood in silence and remembered those who died in Israel's wars and terrorist strikes. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett used the opportunity to lament how Palestinians through the years have chosen death over life.
If only our enemies had invested in building their future, a tenth of the energy they invest in harming us, their situation would have been completely different. But they choose the sanctification of death, which leaves them wallowed in poverty, misery, and a constant sense of victimhood.
He added a common thread runs through all the waves of terror Israel has suffered through the years.
The characteristics are different, but the motivation remains the same, to turn our lives here in our homeland into hell.
The concern for many is that this wave of terrorism will lead to another war between Hamas and Israel, just like it did 1 year ago. The attacks also raise the likelihood that the current government, led by Bennett, may collapse. Mansour Abbas, the head of the Islamist Party, is under enormous pressure to leave the coalition. With the current Knesset tied at 60 seats, even a defection of 1 or 2 seats could lead to new elections. Well, referring to the last several weeks of terror attacks, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman says the danger to the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount has been an accusation by groups like Hamas for decades.
Al-Aqsa is under attack is just a lie, and it was never under attack. It hasn't been under attack by, certainly not by Israel or the Jewish people in its history, but if you go back to 1929, go back that far, the Hebron massacre in Hebron, why did it start? Because of a rumor, a narrative that Al-Aqsa was under attack. Wasn't true then, but people died. Anytime Hamas wants to foment unrest, they go for the Al-Aqsa under attack card. Now, the media will show pictures of people throwing stones and smoke and everything. It's a tiny fraction of the time spent by Muslim worshippers during the month of Ramadan at Al-Aqsa. A tiny fraction. I mean, there are all kinds of beautiful pictures of Muslim families having picnics there, having iftars there. And there's no nation in the history of the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, no nation that has done more to preserve and protect the rights of Muslim worshippers to pray freely at the 3rd holiest site in Islam than the government of Israel. That doesn't sit well with Israel's enemies, doesn't sit well with Hamas, doesn't sit well even with the PA. And so, you know, during the holy month of Ramadan, when people's emotions are strong, you have this narrative. It'll go away because it's not true. Now, why do people care about it? Because nobody wants violence. Nobody wants to see their street, upset.
The Palestinian Authority receives hundreds of millions of dollars each year from the U.S., Israel, and the European Union. One watchdog group is criticizing the lack of financial accountability and asks why there's no trail on how that money is spent. This also leads to questions on whether some of it is going to terrorism. Over the last few years, the Palestinian Authority has changed its financial reporting, and a leading watchdog group wants to know what it's trying to hide.
It used to publish, albeit limited, financial reportings on a monthly basis and an annual basis, but slowly but surely they've been cutting back the amount of publications that they put out.
After researching the issue, Maurice Hirsch of the Palestinian Media Watch found the PA hasn't published its annual budget in 4 years.
That means that no one really knows how the Palestinian Authority plans to use their money that they have coming in every year, international donor money, Israeli money that's coming in as a result of the Oslo Accords, and even their own money. Almost every country in the world publishes a budget. The Palestinian Authority, which is so dependent on international aid, doesn't publish its budget.
Hirsch says even published accounting information of what had been spent is now missing.
When you go onto the website of the Palestinian Ministry of Finance, there is no access to any financial details whatsoever.
CBN News repeatedly attempted to contact the Palestinian Authority, but was unable to get a response. Since its beginning in 1994, the international community has basically funded the Palestinian Authority. More than half of that money comes from Israel, mostly taxes collected from Palestinians working in the country. While the PA collects domestic taxes, the rest of its funding comes from the European Union and the United States.
The reason really that they're trying to hide their finances is that Palestinian Media Watch has repeatedly used the reports that they do publish in order to highlight the fact that they pay hundreds of millions of dollars in rewards to terrorists every single year.
That's why Congress passed the Taylor Force Act in 2018. Taylor Force was a U.S. military veteran murdered in a terror attack in Israel. His murderer was killed in the attack, and so his family receives a stipend because he was a terrorist. The Taylor Force Act doesn't allow the U.S. to give direct economic aid to the PA unless it stops paying stipends to terrorists and the families of dead terrorists.
There's just the aid which is going indirectly via U.S. aid for the benefit of the Palestinians.
USAID and the United Nations Relief Works Agency funding goes to infrastructure projects to schools and health clinics for the people. But that frees up other monies in the PA budget that could be used to pay terrorists.
What we've also shown is that the PA has been siphoning off almost $1 billion shekel, hundreds of millions of dollars, every year, at least for the last 3 years, to what they call the PLO institutions.
Hirsch says there's plenty the West can do to hold the Palestinian Authority accountable. He also says transferring money to institutions belonging to the PLO should be prohibited. He says these are elementary requirements that should be implemented quickly.
Rewarding terrorism does not promote peace. Siphoning off billions of dollars in order for these PLO institutions to, again, directly or indirectly finance, fund, promote terrorism does not promote peace.
Coming up, a sobering report that 300 million people could soon face food shortage due to the war in Ukraine. More than 300 million people in the world's poorest countries could soon be facing acute hunger. That's because the war in Ukraine is affecting the global food supply. Chuck Holton brings us this report from Egypt on what may happen to people who depend on Ukraine's wheat for survival.
Spring is in full bloom across Ukraine, and the winter wheat will soon be ready for harvest. The Russian invasion, however, has everyone focused on mere survival, and the fighting will likely ensure much of this wheat never gets harvested. And the wheat stored in these silos near Odessa can't make it to market because of Russia's blockade of ports on the Black Sea. That bodes poorly for many countries that rely on Ukrainian wheat for survival. In Lebanon, it's estimated the country will be out of grain in less than 2 months.
The impact of the Ukraine war on Lebanon is going to be unfortunately multifaceted, and we've seen that already, not only in the wheat supply that's coming into the country, but even calls to our hotline for families looking for extra support. Normally, UNICEF supports 130,000 children every month with a small cash grant of $40 US. And in recent weeks, the number of calls to our helpline has more than tripled as families have really struggled to put food on the table.
And in Egypt, more than 80% of the 270 million loaves of bread the country consumes each day are made with wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So here, people see big problems on the horizon. In Cairo, people on a fixed income are already feeling the pinch of high prices.
The bread in Egypt is like the backbone because most of the people need bread to eat. And the point is the price for the bread went up. Some here for the bakery doesn't make much more like before. He came to make less number of breads. So now if you have to get like 10 pieces, you got just 5. The bread came to be 30% more, which is like 65, 70 piastres per piece, and in somewhere it can be £1 one piece.
Food security has always been extremely important here in the desert in Egypt. This granary beside me, some people believe, was built by Joseph from the Bible in the 7 fat years that Egypt had before the 7 lean years, where they stored up grain and then sold it to the entire world. And they believe that the money that they gained from all of that grain enabled them to build some of the biggest monuments in the world, including the Great Pyramid. But today, Egypt is much less prepared for what looks to be lean years ahead. To counter this, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has demanded the nation's farmers dedicate a portion of their land to growing wheat. Those who fail to produce their quota face fines and possible jail time. This Egyptian farmer says threats aren't necessary.
I'm happy to grow more wheat this year because the prices are much higher. I've already sold all my winter crop and it will give my family a good life.
Any added grain grown by local farmers, though, won't come close to making up the shortfall from Ukraine. For that reason, Egyptians are cutting back already and blaming Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, the flour also here get really more expensive because it's a crazy Russian government. He's crazy.
From Cairo, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Up next, a look at a special photo archive chronicling the miraculous history of Israel. Long before digital cameras, cell phones, and computers, one Jewish organization not only helped develop Israel, it documented the land's history in pictures. As part of Israel's 74th year of independence, CBN News Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl takes a look back at the special effort to chronicle the Jewish state's story.
This may look like a storage room full of old files, although in reality it's a treasure trove providing a pictorial history of Israel.
We're at the heart of the archive, at the photo archive. This is the place where we can find printed photographs taken from early 20th century and all the way till the end of the printed material era.
Decades before the Jewish state's birth, Karen Kayemet Israel Jewish National Fund, or KKL-JNF, was breaking ground.
KKL-JNF is an organization that was established 120 years ago, aimed at purchasing land in Eretz Israel, right here in Israel, and also developing it, which means preparing the land after purchasing it for housing, building new communities, helping people get here so they can fully establish and inhabit these homes.
Efrat Sinai, head of KKL-JNF Photo Archive, says cameras have continued snapping history since the beginning.
KKL-JNF used to send photographers to different corners all over Israel so they can capture what is going on, the places that are being built and established, the faces of the pioneers, all that spirit of creating something new. And that's what created this unique and very important collection.
One of Sinai's favorites is this unique pose of David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister.
It's not something that we're used to seeing him with cool sunglasses. There's another picture, which I really like. David Ben-Gurion on the day of the Declaration of Independence, while he's still working out the draft of that declaration.
And a year later, on Israel's first birthday,
these are photographs from the very first year of the celebration in 1949. As you can see, bringing the Torah books. And what I wanted to show you was the military parades that were taking place in the big cities. We can see how everyone used to go out to the balconies and watch the parade. And you can also see the streets, the familiar streets of Jerusalem. This is King George Street, for example, taken in 1950.
And capturing Independence Day celebrations, picnics, and barbecues that go back decades. In addition to acquiring land, KKL-JNF prepared it for housing, built reservoirs, rehabbed rivers, and is probably best known for planting trees.
Here we have photographs taken in Martyrs Forest. This is a forest that was planted in the early 1950s. It has 6 million trees planted in to commemorate the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust.
According to Sinai, it's estimated there were around 14,000 trees here when the Ottoman Turkish Empire ended more than 100 years ago.
Starting 1908, we started trying to plant trees here. And nowadays we're talking about over 240 million trees planted all over Israel.
There's also historic Jerusalem, overlooking the city from the Mount of Olives, the distribution of pasteurized milk to babies, the railway station from 1927, and the Western Wall in 1941, as well as photographs of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. Pioneers building agricultural communities called kibbutzim and moshavim, and glass plate negatives used before the gelatin kind.
So this was taken in 1924, and this is Tel Aviv. You can see the sand. So it really is a city that rose from the sands.
Throughout each year, KKL-JNF shares its historic highlights at exhibitions like this one in Jerusalem.
We're displaying photographs 2.5 meters wide, historical photographs of Jerusalem that were colorized.
The KKL-JNF says many times when we look at black and white photos, we tend to think the past was lived without color. But what they've done in this exhibit, they've used an innovative colorization technology along with research into the fashion and culture of the time to put color in the photos and breathe new life into history. An exhibition also took place recently at the International Expo in Dubai. Many of the photos are now digitized, and the archive can be viewed online in Hebrew and soon will be available in English. It currently has more than 1 million photos, and like the State of Israel itself, is still growing. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Still ahead, an Israeli organization steps in to give life-saving heart surgery to a Ukrainian child. An Israeli group known for treating children with heart defects is helping a little girl from Ukraine to live free from heart disease. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
5-year-old Ukrainian Karina Andreyko just received life-saving heart treatment in Israel.
Karina was born with a defect inside her heart between the 2 atriums, and this defect makes a lot of blood to shunt from the left side of the heart to the right and makes the right side of the heart big.
Her mom, Irina Andreyko, sought help from Israel's field hospital just 3 miles from their home near the Polish border. There, doctors diagnosed Karina with a congenital defect, treatable with a procedure available in Israel, but not in Ukraine. That's when Save a Child's Heart stepped in.
We immediately said that we'll be happy to help, and a very fast operation began to start the logistics of bringing the girl from a war zone to Israel, issuing passports, entry permits, vaccinations, examinations, and within 2 weeks she was brought to Israel.
Based at the Wolfson Medical Center in Holon, Israel, Save a Child's Heart has saved the lives of more than 5,000 children from 59 countries since it started more than 25 years ago.
For us at Save a Child's Heart, it doesn't matter where the child comes from. It could be a Ukrainian child, it could be a child from Gaza, it could be a child from Iraq, from Syria, from Africa. We are here to help them and to save their lives.
According to Tamar Shapira from Save a Child's Heart, Karina has a twin back in Ukraine, and the family lives in an area heavily damaged by the war.
Mother's not working, the girls are not going to kindergarten, the father was recruited to fight with the forces of Ukraine, and their condition is very bad.
We are a country that underwent many wars, and we are also raising our children in a war zone, in essence. So although we can relate to her anxiousness and stress because we know how she feels. We had missiles thrown on my house and my children like she had on hers, so we understand her. And my grandparents were refugees from Europe, so we can relate. But again, I think we are lucky, and we felt that we need to help her all we can.
I am happy that I came to Israel for my child to have an operation here. On the one hand, I'm very worried about her, but I think everything will be fine.
Doctors say Karina's prognosis is good, and she should have a completely normal life. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
That's a good news story from here in Israel. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.